Spider-Man Homecoming is a great film, but it's got a very deep-seated flaw. This past summer saw the theatrical release of Spider-Man Homecoming, the 6th theatrical Spider-Man film in 15 years. Its existence was predicated on Spidey himself making an appearance in last summer's Captain America Civil War, which finally brought the beloved Webhead into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Although the only reason that this was able to happen was because Sony dragged Spider-Man's cinematic reputation through the mud over the course of 3 movies between 2007 and 2014, and they decided to finally work with Disney to figure out what to do with problem child Parker. But hey, at least we got Spider-Man home, sort of, at last. Homecoming was a critical and financial success. Audiences loved it, and this was all in spite of the fact that it was, again, the 6th Spider-Man film in 15 years and the 3rd cinematic incarnation of the character. This may have been partially because of the overwhelmingly positive reception that the character saw during his brief appearance in Captain America Civil War last year. While Spidey himself could be removed from that movie entirely and the plot and character arcs would largely be, well, actually totally be unaffected, it was a nice breath of fresh air seeing this take on Spider-Man. Tom Holland set himself apart from both Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield in the 30 or so minutes of screen time that he got. Now, that's not to say that Maguire and Garfield were bad or don't compare to Holland, but in my opinion, Maguire pretty much nailed the awkward, nerdy, emotionally conflicted, and stressed out person that was Peter Parker, but he didn't always quite fit Spider-Man. Whereas Andrew Garfield was great with the cocky attitude of Spider-Man, but I couldn't take him seriously as Peter Parker. He seemed too much of a sort of a hipster, sort of like a Edward Cullen type. Tom Holland, however, balances the day-to-day bullied and emotionally exhausted high schooler that is Peter Parker, as well as the confident, hard-headed, and caring hero that is Spider-Man. And while Civil War only gave audiences a taste of that, it was more than enough to leave them wanting more, and that's where Homecoming comes in. Leading up to its release, Homecoming was being described as very John Hughes-esque, movies like The Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and influence from John Hughes films of the 1980s can definitely be seen in the final film. The story takes place a couple months or so after the events of Civil War, and in Civil War, Peter tells Tony Stark that he's had his powers for about 6 months. This means that, unlike previous incarnations of the character on screen, Homecoming would not be retelling Spider-Man's origin story, a prospect that audiences had been dreading. Instead, Homecoming features a Spider-Man who is already established in New York, but is still fairly new to the whole superhero thing. To sweeten the deal and further set himself apart from previous cinematic versions, Peter would have a father figure in Tony Stark who would look out for him and sort of help him along at various points in the film. But there is one single critical component to the MCU incarnation of Spider-Man that is sorely lacking, and has been ever since Captain America Civil War. The key part of every good, compelling, and relatable character in fiction that helps to humanize and empathize with them. The crux of who they are and why they do what they do. In the MCU, Peter Parker has given no clear reason why he does what he does as Spider-Man. Whenever the topic comes up, the only reasons that Peter gives are incredibly vague, hollow, or straight up non-answers.
Why are you doing this? I gotta know, what's your MO? What gets you out of that twin bed in the morning?
Because I've been me my whole life, and I've had these powers for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
I read books, I build computers. And yeah, I would love to play football, but I couldn't then, so I shouldn't now.
Sure, because you're different.
Exactly. But I can't tell anybody that, so I'm not. Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
So you want to look out for the little guy, you want to do your part, make the world a better place, all that, right?
Yeah, just looking out for the little guy. That's what it is.
This all goes back to Homecoming not being an origin story and audiences not wanting to see the origin on screen for the 3rd time in 15 years. People know about the spider bite. They know that Uncle Ben is shot. They know with great power comes great responsibility because the Raimi trilogy is still so ingrained in popular culture. Moviegoers want something they haven't seen before, and I get it. I really do. But so far, the MCU has been bending over backwards to not just prevent itself from retreading the same ground as previous versions of Spider-Man, but to just steer clear of the matter altogether in Homecoming. So much so that when Ned asks Peter if Aunt May knows that he goes out at night as Spider-Man, Peter says to him that he can't do that to her because of all the stuff she's been through. Hint, hint. To someone familiar with the character, this makes sense, and you know exactly what he's talking about. She recently lost her husband, Ben Parker, and now she has to raise her nephew on her own with what little money that she has. The problem with this, though, is that the film is relying on knowledge that the audience attained from outside the scope of the film or this particular movie franchise, the MCU. Knowledge that the film does not provide. Knowledge that comes from an external source that is unrelated to the film outside the fact that, hey, it's still Spider-Man. It's still Marvel. The knowledge of why Spider-Man helps people is not present in the MCU. Doing so robs Peter Parker of his primary motivator to help others and to look out for the little guy. Without the pop cultural reference point and context provided by previous Spider-Man films, albeit films that are separate from the MCU, what little reasoning Peter has for helping people that he provides in Captain America Civil War is hollow, nearly nonsensical, and is almost totally meaningless. And Homecoming's insistence on continuing on with this avoidance of the character's primary motivator to the point where they won't even utter the name Ben Parker leads me to the conclusion that Spider-Man Homecoming has no heart. Now, that's not to say that I don't like Spider-Man Homecoming, or that it doesn't hold up, or that it's a bad film. I enjoyed Spider-Man Homecoming. I paid to see it a second time in theaters. Its story holds up on its own. Character motivations, in the context of the film's own plot, the keyword being plot, are clear. The film is well written. The characters are not only sympathetic but endearing, and Michael Keaton did a phenomenal job as Adrian Toomes. That car scene towards the end of the second act, like sort of that act break between Act 2 and 3, just everything on that man's face as he's slowly connecting the dots and figuring out what's going on, figuring out that Peter is Spider-Man. Just his facial expressions say more than 1,000 words ever could. Keaton was perfect. It's easily better than both of the Amazing Spider-Man films and Spider-Man 3 to me, but not quite on the level of Raimi's Spider-Man 1 and 2, again, at least in my opinion. It's just that the film's adamancy to stay as far away from Uncle Ben's death as possible really does hurt Peter Parker as a character. I said that character motivations in Homecoming in the context of the film's own plot are clear, and I meant that. Even in the case of Peter Parker himself. I really do mean that. While he still helps people and chases thugs down early in the film, which is still based around the loss of Uncle Ben, the actions he takes that drive the film's plot forward, tracking down the Vulture and trying to shut down his operations, are also motivated by his desire to prove himself to Tony Stark and officially become a member of the Avengers. This causes him to take on too much and endanger the lives of civilians, forcing Stark to step in and clean up his mess and take away the advanced suit he gave to Peter in Civil War. And this still doesn't deter Peter, and he still continues to pursue the Vulture in order to prove that he is capable of such large tasks. In the context of the plot of this film, it works. However, what confuses me about Homecoming's approach to not retreading the character's origins is that, while it goes out of its way to specifically not mention Uncle Ben in any capacity, there's still a sequence in the film where Ned asks Peter all these questions about, well, Spider-Man. About how he got his powers, the powers that he can do. And Peter tells him it was a spider bite. That's how I'm able to be super strong and stick to walls. Oh, and the spider's dead. So the film clearly doesn't have a problem retreading how he got his powers and how he became Spider-Man, but it still seems to have a problem with explaining the why of Spider-Man. His explanation in Civil War is too damn vague to mean anything without the context that previous Spider-Man films provide. Context which should be coming from within the MCU as well. Oh, but you already said why they didn't do this, you may be saying. There were already 5 movies and 2 origin stories, audiences already know! Well, then think of it like this then. Decades from now, there will be a generation of kids who will hear about this Marvel Cinematic Universe thing that their parents and grandparents are going on about. It was this big movie franchise from decades ago. It spanned so many movies, and they all connected to each other in some way. It may be their very first exposure to Marvel Comics characters. They watched the first 12 movies and enjoyed them, and then when they come to the 13th movie, Captain America Civil War, this new character, Spider-Man, shows up. He's a teenage superhero. The kids feel like they can empathize with him and really relate to him because of his age. And then they go and finally see Spider-Man Homecoming, assuming they're watching these movies in order. By this point, it's very possible that Tom Holland would be considered the definitive cinematic Spider-Man. After all, he is part of the MCU, and that's sort of the definitive Marvel movie series, as it were. So after watching Homecoming, they still have no idea why he does what he does. And you could just say, oh, well, you have to watch the other 5 movies that came before, or at the very least the Raimi trilogy to understand, but that's... what? Why should you have to watch a movie or a series of movies that are disconnected from what you're watching narratively and thematically in order to understand what you are watching on the most basic level as far as the main character goes? And that's not to say that future generations shouldn't have to watch the old Spider-Man movies at all, or that the MCU version of the character replaces his predecessors. What I'm saying is that people shouldn't have to delve into material outside the scope of a story in order to understand the story. For example, I love Big Finish's Doctor Who audio plays, but I shouldn't have to listen to them to understand what happens in the TV show. By that same token, the rest of the MCU's major heroes have had their reasons for acting as they do explored on screen. Tony Stark saw his weapons being used against his countrymen and wanted to make sure that that kind of carnage would never happen because of him. Bruce Banner doesn't want to be responsible for the destruction caused by his alter ego. Thor realized the responsibility his heritage places upon him. Steve Rogers has seen the downfall of nations and governments that started as good intentions. The Guardians of the Galaxy work together to survive in a rough universe. Scott Lang wants to be seen as a hero in his daughter's eyes after he's served prison time for white-collar crime. Black Panther is protecting the interests of his country after his father's assassination has put him on the throne. Stephen Strange wishes to expand his understanding of the supernatural after being so dismissive of such things when he needed them most. But Spider-Man? In the context of the MCU thus far, he just wants to help the little guy and be an Avenger. And while he turns down the opportunity for the latter at the end of Homecoming, he did so on the belief that he wasn't ready yet. But unlike his contemporaries, it's never explained why he wants to do the former. Imagine that the first Iron Man movie from 2008 didn't have the character's origin story. The first act of the movie, which shows Tony Stark in the desert in a cave held captive by the Ten Rings, is no longer part of the film, and all references to it have been excised. You would have no idea what sparked Tony's desire to act as he does as Iron Man. No idea why he has the arc reactor in his chest outside of maybe a reference to it keeping shrapnel from reaching his heart. And thus he would be a far less compelling character as a result. I imagine that audiences would be a bit confused and less engaged by that prospect. Now imagine that, on top of that, I told you that to understand Tony Stark's background and origins, you'd have to go out of your way to either read decades-old comics or watch a hypothetical Iron Man movie from 1993 that is disconnected from this 2008 version, but features an origin story. How would you feel about that? Critical components of a narrative or the motivations of a character should not have to be explained or explored by going outside the confines of the media containing that narrative or character. You shouldn't have to leave Destiny to read grimoire cards online to understand who everyone around you giving you missions are, but you do. You shouldn't have to read multiple novels and comics to understand who all these new people who show up in Halo 5 are, but you do. You shouldn't have to play every Kingdom Hearts game on every platform to even begin to grasp the plot of Kingdom Hearts 3, but you do. Granted, the HD collections kind of mitigate that, but that's beside the point. And you shouldn't have to watch previous Spider-Man films or read the comics in order to understand the character of Peter Parker and what drives him in a standalone film, but you do. And the thing is, it's not impossible to have your cake and eat it too. Homecoming could have skipped past the origin story and not skirt around Uncle Ben entirely. The 2008 animated series The Spectacular Spider-Man proves this. It took place sometime after Uncle Ben's death, but it was still discussed by Peter and Aunt May several times, and it weighed heavily on Peter. When Peter is caving into the symbiote's influence later in season 1, his memory of Uncle Ben kept him going. Ben's death isn't shown, but the effects of it are felt throughout the entire show. I'm not saying Homecoming needed a scene where Peter interacts with his memories of Uncle Ben, but for God's sakes, at the very least, they could have discussed how it felt to lose him in no uncertain terms. Even if Uncle Ben is mentioned or brought up in the inevitable sequel, it may be too late. This is something that needs to be established early on, or else it'll come off as damage control, like how Batman v Superman went out of its way to mention that the areas where all the action was taking place were either uninhabited, deserted, or everyone had already left for the night, or something like that. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you agree with my analysis of Spider-Man Homecoming and its lack of motivation for the protagonist? Did you enjoy the film regardless? How does it compare to its predecessors in your opinion? What do you make of Tom Holland? Who is your favorite Spider-Man and why? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you didn't like it, go ahead and hit that dislike button. And if you want to see more Second Opinion, then please subscribe to Snapped Films for more episodes. Until then, I'll see you guys next time.